So, I'm ready to finish up this chapter. I feel like there'll be a little bit more clarity on some of the ideologies that we cover in the next chapter, and hopefully I didn't keep repeating myself too much in some of these things, although in a certain sense, um, it was kind of almost a necessity of the topic, and it was kind of incorporated into the discussion of this section in any case. And so this painting right here is one of the first paintings to actually put railway, a railroad in it. Okay, from 1844, Turner, the painter Joseph Turner. This is kind of a a romanticized version of it. It's mystical, right? And as you notice in the textbook in 675, Sir Walter Scott, some may or may not know the Scottish romantic novelist, he ends up, referring to some of these advances of industrialization as beautiful works of art. You're going to see later that the romantic movement, and maybe you're used to hearing the term romantic like, oh, is my boyfriend or girlfriend, do they want to be romantic? That comes from this time period, but that's like a popularized way of using it. That's not the full meaning of it. So that's not what we're just referring to. It's a whole entire world outlook. And so essentially you're going to see a reaction that looks at this world in a much more negative way. That the romantics, like the workers, are going to see the exploitation, the pollution, the darkness, and they're going to look at the Enlightenment and just like disgust in many ways. We'll talk about that more later. Now, moving on, just to end here, that we talked about in some of the previous chapters, that this idea of imperialism and having a power, a metropolis, colonization, and that the West was affecting the non-West in different ways and taking benefits that not necessarily the non-Western world was not receiving. I talked a little bit about the opium in China, but this is, I think, quite a disturbing legacy that's really profound and something that we should think about. And it's something that Chinese nationalists don't forget. And I think that this is something that I just want to point out, that we should always remember that the West hasn't been involved with the rest of the world for a long time, even including the United States. And when those relationships have been not on the positive side for those other people, which usually it has not, they've not forgot that. Okay? Forgotten? I don't know. Am I speaking proper English? Anyways, excuse me. In any case, this legacy is profound. And it is still a part of the way that there's a skepticism about Western trade. And it's not to say, again, that, for instance, China does its own things to other nations in the area. I mean, Tibet is a more controversial issue. But in the case of the Opium War, I mean, for all of American workers and European workers being upset that everything now is made in China, and the idea that the Asians are taking our jobs. When I was younger in the Cold War, by the way, it wasn't all about China. No one cared. It was about Japan. There was even a stupid comedy that was made about it. I think with Billy Crystal or something. There was this big theme that Japan was taken over. And then they've become marginalized, and now it's China. Well, it just so happens that Japan and China wanted nothing to do with us. They were completely fine in being isolated. And when I say us, I'm talking about the Western world. And in Japan, specifically the United States. Japan and China were essentially both forced into doing trade and being involved with the West, and at their expense. So they didn't want drugs. Imagine this, opium. We're talking about opium, not good for you. This is not even, even people who smoke weed don't say, oh my gosh, the world would be a better place with opium. No, and now of course we see the results of heroin and all these other things. But the China didn't want it. China did not want drugs. The British Empire, the eloquent, classy, proper Englishmen in attire, was shoving opium down the throats of China. And then what happens? I hope you read this text. The Chinese were being destroyed by it. My professor in my Modern East Asia class showed pictures after pictures of slides of just streets full of people who look like every other place you see a disastrous set of heroin addicts that are just completely wasted, and shells of human beings being destroyed on this very powerful drug. And so the Chinese government said enough of it, and they destroyed those opium goods. And that was an excuse for the British to basically go in with their new advanced technology, beat the you-know-what out of the Chinese, and then basically say, you're going to pay the money back to our merchants. You're going to allow us liberties to come in and have diplomatic immunity here. We're going to have some uneven trades to our advantage. And by the way, here's some more opium. Oh, and here's some Christianity too. And again, that's not to disrespect the Christianity part, but there is a fact there that this is what I want to try to explain. For Asian nationalists that see missionaries and saw a lot of the legacy of the West as a conspiracy against them, and that persecuted Christians, this is what they remember. This is rooted in this legacy. So again, I happen to know Chinese Christians who are actually very happy to be Christians and don't see a negative view about Christianity, and they don't link it with this. But I'm saying that for politicians, and I'm saying for many nationalists, they're going to all see this as something that they're not going to forget. And again, the wealth that's going to be extracted there is going to be at their expense, okay? And later on, when China has a communist revolution, a lot of this backdrop is going to be the conversation that's taking place from their leaders with the common Chinese person to even motivate people to side with them, okay? So just want you to think about that. Now, India also faced the same thing. Total British political control, and they controlled this trade between India and Asian countries, and this was to the total advantage of Britain. I mean, think how much they thrived, and yet think about what this does to them. And I think that we need to remember that this legacy, again, with India, same is not far off, okay? And it created imbalance of trade. I just want to point out that now London is pejoratively called Londonistan because there's so many people from Pakistan or from India. And so you have all of these people who are there from these countries. And you have a lot of complaints from people in the British Isles saying, well, they're taking over our country. And there were some activists that put up a poster that said, people like from India said, we are here because you were there. And you'll notice this, that where there's large immigrant populations in Europe, many of them are people coming from the former colonies from this time period. So that's something else just kind of interesting to think about as well. Okay, so we see the same thing that took place with Latin America and the economic relationship with Britain, and when you're reading that, now it's really the United States that dominates the economic life of people in Latin America. So much so that, by the way, there was in Venezuela, when Hugo Chavez was still alive, you may or may not know who he was. I saw him defying the United States, and this is when Bush was still president. And so did my friend, and he got busy, and he was going to, he was courting some girl, and so he came over to the coffee shop that I used to own, a small coffee shop, and I just said, hey man, somebody got overthrown in a military coup. Who do you think it was? Because I knew he wasn't following the news, and he just looked at me, without a blink, he said, Hugo Chavez. Now, why did he say that? We already knew that the U.S. government was going to make something happen. There's a long history that any Latin American leaders in the past that would defy the United States, they would disappear. Something would happen. The military would step in and something. Okay. And Latin America, there's a book called Open Veins of Latin America. It talks about this legacy, and it didn't start with us, but now we're kind of been in that role, and things are shifting there. So, these are things that everybody in Latin America knows, and if you don't know it from the United States, then you should at least know it, whatever your politics are. Maybe you think it's justifiable, but I'm just telling you, okay? Now, then we go to Ireland. Here, one of the largest immigrant populations that in the United States, I believe these are one of the largest immigrant populations, meaning those of us who come from a certain ethnic background are Irish, okay? And a lot of people from Ireland came here under the context of being treated quite terribly by the British. And if you read this small little section, the internal colony, you'll see we're talking about over 1 million died in a famine that didn't need to die, okay? And then 1 million more. Because of the policies that the British had. Jonathan Swift, who was the guy who did Gulliver's Travels, you might have read in high school an indecent proposal that a satire that he wrote, where he addressed the fact of this massive death there, and talked about maybe the parents could just eat their kids or something like that, kind of pointing out that that's the condition that they were being put to. Now, here's also what I want to point out. When communism in socialist countries had large famines, or other countries, and they died because of bad policies, this was always blamed on communism. You don't hear about 1 million deaths dying because of capitalism, or you don't see it blamed on the system. You see it blamed on, let's say, Britain per se. And I guess what I want to pose the question to you to think is, when one nation does a tragedy to another nation, are we always getting it right when it comes to exactly pinpointing where the blame lies? Is it racism? Is it classism? Is there economic interests? Or what do we make of that? But in any case, there's a lot there to think about. And it also kind of shows you that whether it was nations of people of color, or Ireland being treated a certain way, when it came to certain establishments' interests, they didn't have a problem letting 1 million people die because it wasn't in their interest to care. Okay, and I hate to go on a negative note like that, but it's something to think about. And why I also want you to think about it is because when we go into the next chapter, the whole thing of ideological and conflict is going to mean a lot of people are going to think about it. People are going to want to address it more and more and more, as they do today, and they still have not resolved it. And so, in any case, I think, as I go back, and I'll say it again and again, once you kind of start looking at this legacy and you see all of this here, you're basically coming up to speed with realizing the condition of the world now, and so many of the things that are not resolved. But you'll also see where so many people are muddling so many arguments and kind of confusing histories, and not getting why other parts of the world react in a certain way, or make commentary that doesn't seem to fit right with us, or doesn't make sense. Well, a lot of things do make sense. That's the problem, or that's something to be addressed. Okay, so I'm going to end here. Let me move on to chapter 22, a very important chapter that I'm going to enjoy going over with you. Okay.